does whatever he pleases. He does whatever he pleases. He does whatever he pleases. He does whatever he pleases. Pleases, 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 pleases.
Yo, the sovereign Lord, great I am, recognize the name. He's always on top of his game, a lion that simply cannot be tamed. And no, he is not restrained at all, nobody can stop his...
All right, welcome to the Church Militant New England podcast. Man, I love that jam. It's an oldie but a goodie. Do appreciate you listening. If you do listen to this program, you know that 99% of the time I basically throw up my sermons, at least when I remember to put them up. Otherwise, if I do forget them, you can always go at northwesthillschurch.org and go to the Sermon and Media page and check those out. And I hope those are edifying to you and beneficial. I wanted to get to podcasting topical programs like this more in 2019. Unfortunately, well, I suppose fortunately and unfortunately, it was a busy year. It was busy in the sense that we welcomed our 8th child into the world, and so baby Benjamin is here, and we named him Benjamin because we think it may be our last child, and so we thought that would be fitting, and he's great. And lots of responsibilities here at the church in terms of preaching, teaching, and all of the other pastoral responsibilities. And then additionally, I've been doing two kind of extracurricular things. I've been serving with Forge Theological Seminary. Maybe a year or two after I finished up my doctoral work there, I started working with them as an adjunct faculty member. And I was, supervising some programs and helping some students. And then additionally, I got involved in revamping and sort of reissuing their Associate of Theology. And I'm working on the Bachelor of Theology program a little bit right now, trying to get some of those courses up to snuff, improve upon them. And that's sort of wrapping up as we speak. And then additionally, and I should note, I'm going to stay with Forge, keep serving in the adjunct role, but I probably won't be doing as much curriculum development as I had been. And then additionally, I've been working on the certification process with the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors. And I'm at the tail end of that on Phase 3, which is the supervision phase. And boy, I have just learned a lot in this process. I highly recommend the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, ACBC. If you need counseling, if you need to refer someone, or if in fact you want to get some training in that regard, ACBC is really the best organization for that. And so I recommend that to you. biblicalcounseling.com, I think, is their website. And there's a number of really good books introducing that subject. One I'm in the middle of right now, Jeremy Lealick, Biblical Counseling Basics, Roots, Beliefs, and Future. And there's others as well, but really good material and really helpful. And so if you're in the ministry or even if you're a layperson and you want to be able to help people with their problems, help people through some of the struggles of life, that would be a real good resource to check out. So hopefully in 2020 I will have more of an opportunity to record programs like these. I'd like to do it concurrent with my whatever material I'm studying, which is kind of how today's program has come about. So I was spending some time in Genesis chapter 16, looking at the question of the angel of the Lord, and I'm thinking about working on a project in that regard. And in 2018, I had the privilege of editing a book and contributing to that, where I dealt with the question of Christology, Christology in the Old Testament and the angel of the Lord. And I'm looking to build on some of that material and sort of pull it all together in a full-blown Christology. And so whether that'll come out by way of article or book, we'll see about that. But if you wanted to see that material, Our God is Triune, Essays in Biblical Theology, and it's on Church Militant Publications is the publisher, and you can get it at most bookstores, most Christian bookstores, Amazon, Barnes, whatever. And you might even be able to find a few used copies out there real cheap. So as I was studying that, I came across a program entitled the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, which is a podcast which, as its name states, seeks to promote biblical Unitarian teaching. And the host is Dr. Dustin Smith, who I've seen his material here and around over the years, and I've heard him on a number of other programs, heard him interviewed, and I've heard some of the things that he said. And I'm sure he's a very nice gentleman, seems like a sharp guy. And in this particular program, this is episode 84 of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, he begins a series, which I don't remember how many parts it has, but has quite a few parts, where he talks about the angel of the Lord and messengers and this sort of thing in the Old Testament. And I think what he seeks to do is to basically answer the claims of Christians who say that the angel of the Lord is Christ, is the Son of God, pre-incarnate, which, of course, biblical Unitarians reject any notion of real personal pre-existence of the Son of God. And, of course, they reject his deity. And so, it would seem obviously problematic if we can walk through the Old Testament and demonstrate progressively that a pre-existent divine Son of God is there. And that's what I hope to do on this program, because some of the things that he says here are really problematic. Now, before I dive into this, last episode I dealt with some material that Dr. Dale Tuggy had, some comments he made, dealing with the Shema and 1 Corinthians 8:6, and he has since responded, and I understand that his response will be in two parts, so two separate programs. And so I'm going to wait until that second program comes out, and then I will, God willing, respond to his response, and we'll see where we can go. I won't comment on his response now, except to say that I wasn't seeing much interaction with the text or the claims there. It seemed like he was sort of scoffing at me, which maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but anyway, I do appreciate the interaction from Dr. Tuggy. He's a sharp guy, nice guy. He's got a good sense of humor, I think. And intellectually, I don't think he's much of a slouch, right? I think he has a doctoral degree from Brown, which I believe is an Ivy League institution. So no slouch intellectually. But I will interact with that material when it comes down the pike. Now, I'm going to begin by playing some of this material, and as I play it, I will stop to respond to it, and hopefully we can make it through this program of Dr. Smith's as within this one podcast episode. And so here goes.
We are beginning a new study here on the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, looking into angels and how these heavenly messengers relate to God and Jesus. In the Old Testament, it is not uncommon for the one true God to send an angel in order to communicate an important announcement or perform an important task on God's behalf. Yet some of the texts seem to blur the lines between God and the angel who was sent, making it difficult for many readers to know exactly who is talking and calling into question who the angel actually is. There have been a variety of proposed solutions on the apparent blending of the sender God and the sent angel. Some feel that angels are actually theophanies, or divine appearances by God embodied in the angel, to where the angel actually is the one true God. Justin Martyr, a 2nd century philosopher turned theologian, was the first to argue that many of these angelic appearances in the Old Testament were pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus Christ. Still, others have proposed that the key to understanding the blurring between God and his angels lies in the nature of angels as messengers. And messengers naturally represent their sender in some heightened capacity.
Okay, so let me just kind of lay my cards here out on the table. It is my position that the angel of the Lord is the Son of God prior to his incarnation, which of course implies his preexistence, and I would say eternal preexistence. And I think when you read the relevant accounts wherein the angel of the Lord appears, it's quite clear that what we're seeing is the appearance of deity, not merely a created agent who is serving on behalf of deity. Now, I would agree that, angel, Malik, simply means that one is sent, but I don't think necessarily that implies an ontology. In fact, I know that it doesn't. Rather, the term Malik, and you can look at Halot, pages, that is the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, pages 585 through 86, and you'd see that Malik is defined as messenger, and it describes a task and not an ontology. It describes what someone does, not what someone is. So if I say, hey, Tom is a mailman, that doesn't mean that Tom, is inferior to me in some way. Rather, it simply means that's what he does. And so when we talk about the angel of the Lord in terms of being a Malik, we're saying that he was sent by God, but that doesn't mean that he isn't God. That would be okay if that's your position, but that's something that needs to be demonstrated and shown. It's not something that is to be simply assumed, which is what Dr. Smith will do throughout this entire program. Now, is Justin the first person to make this argument that the angel of the Lord is in fact the pre-incarnate Christ? Well, I don't know how one would know that. Is he the first one that we have extant literature on who makes this kind of argumentation? That could be. I have one other patristic writer that mentions something like this, and so I'm wondering about the dates and how contemporaneous. And again, when we go back this far in antiquity, we're usually making generalizations about dates and not necessarily all the time. Are we having specific, we can say this came out this year and that sort of thing. All right, let's continue with Dr. Smith.
This episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast will begin examining the key text involving heavenly angels in order to better understand the one true God who sent them. Before we get started, we need to settle a few points on definitions. The word malach in Hebrew and the equivalent Greek word angelos can refer to either human messengers or heavenly angels. Most of the time, however, the context of a given passage is pretty clear as to whether it is referring to a heavenly messenger or a human messenger.
And now, that's true. Certainly, the word malach can be applied to, and for that matter, angelos can be applied to all different personal subjects. It can be applied to men. It can be applied to created beings who come from the heavens. It's also a term that can apply and does apply to God. For example, in Genesis 48, Jacob's prayer, a blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh, it occurs in verses 15 through 16. It says this, "And he," that is Jacob, "blessed Joseph and said, The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, The angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on. Now the verb there, to bless, or in the Hebrew, yebrik, is a singular verb, meaning that there's one individual under consideration in this text. So when he says, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who's been the shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, that's talking about one and the same person. And there are other places in Scripture where we can see clearly that the term angel refers to God. We can look at, say, Malachi 3:1. We can look at Ecclesiastes 5:6. So there are passages which clearly identify God as a Malach, as an angel. And so if you say necessarily that term denotes some kind of inferiority to God, well, you've got a problem when it comes to the way the Bible uses that term. We continue.
But I'll admit there are a handful of texts that are disputed. For this episode, however, we are going to focus solely on the heavenly angelic messengers, looking to see how their words and deeds help us better understand the God who commissioned them. So without further ado, let's begin looking at some of our text. Our first point today is looking at the angel that visited Hagar. I'm going to read a passage out of Genesis 16, starting in verse 7. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are a God who sees. For she said, Have I even remained alive here after seeing him? That's Genesis 16, verses 7 through 13. It is interesting to note that this passage is the first appearance, from a canonical perspective, of the angel of the Lord. It should also be pointed out that there is no definite article in front of angel. So the insistence made by some that this angel of the Lord is the angel of the Lord, as one of a kind angel, is really unwarranted.
Okay, now hold your horses there, Dr. Smith. Now, given that this gentleman has a PhD, I'm going to assume that he's done some work in Hebrew. And I'm going to assume that this is just some kind of slip-up on his part, because we have a pretty significant error here. He says the term Malach Yahweh doesn't have the definite article out in front of it, and therefore it's not to be understood definitely. Well, there's some pretty significant problems with that. First, in Hebrew, a phrase, a definite noun and its modifier, or even an indefinite noun and its modifier, are always in grammatical accord. They're always in agreement. Now, Yahweh is a definite noun. It's a proper name. And because of that, Malach is a definite noun necessarily. Now, there are a few exceptions to that rule. There's a number of exceptions in peculiar places. But the term Malach Yahweh is a definite phrase necessarily. It's necessary for a variety of reasons. And so what we're talking about here is whether or not the phrase should be rendered the angel of the Lord or an angel of the Lord. If it's the angel of the Lord, then that probably indicates that there's a single individual who is under consideration, not numerous angels who serve in that function. And there have been people who have argued both ways. For instance, Vern Poythress, in his book on Theophanies, argues that the angel of Yahweh is at times God himself, but is at other times a created being. A number of authors have argued this way. For example, Rene Lopez came out with an article in 2010 entitled Identifying the Angel of the Lord in the Book of Judges, a model for reconsidering the referent in other Old Testament loci. And that was in the Bulletin for Biblical Research. And he would argue, again, that you would need to take that phrase, the angel of the Lord, and render it indefinitely. When, again, that goes by the typical grammatical convention that the noun must agree with its referent. And so since Yahweh is definite, angel should be definite. And so there's a number of good readings outside of that typical grammatical rule. You never find, for example, the plural construction angels of Yahweh, angels of the Lord. That never occurs in the canon, which is good evidence that the term ought to be rendered definitely. Further, many of the narratives in which the angel of the Lord occurs in, those narratives note the angel's exalted and unique position. For example, the angel of Yahweh is said to have the name of Yahweh in Exodus 23:21. Yahweh says, "My name is in him." Notice it doesn't say, "I've given my name to him," but it says, "My name is in him." He is said to have the ability to forgive sins. We should note that he receives worship, he receives prayer, he receives exaltation and devotion. He takes offerings, and people are fearful of him just in the same way they're fearful of God. In Exodus 33:20, we have this prohibition against seeing God. When Gideon sees God in Judges 6, he says, "Alas, O Lord Yahweh, for now I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face." And so there are a number of considerations in the Old Testament which would imply that, in fact, this is not any old angel, but a specific angel who was no ordinary angel in the economy of God, that he had a specific and identifiable role. Indeed, the angel of the Lord was the one identified in the burning bush, in the pillars of cloud and fire. He was the one who went before the people of God into the promised land. This is not any angel or angels. This is the angel of the Lord, who is, in the Pentateuch, one of the key salvific actors in the entire thing. And so we're not talking about angels, but a specific angel. And again, the argument that is made here by Dr. Smith is that because it doesn't have the definite article in front, means that it shouldn't be rendered definitely. Well, that's, again, simply problematic, because Yahweh is a definite noun, which requires Malach to be a definite noun. And that is simply the grammar at that point. So we continue.
Without much introduction, this angel of the Lord appears on earth by the spring on the road to Shur. This is easily seen and made apparent by the narrator of Genesis. The Hebrew text uses masculine verbs for this messenger, so we can safely presume that the messenger is a male.
Okay, so here he's pointing out the masculine verbs. Now, if you're able to read Hebrew sufficiently enough to understand the gender of verbs, then you should be able to, or you should know the basic fact that a phrase, a nounal phrase, that the noun needs to agree with its modifier. I mean, that's a simple and basic, rudimentary, first semester Hebrew kind of observation. So I'm wondering here, where did the argument come from that says, well, it's not the angel of the Lord, it's an angel of the Lord? Now, as I mentioned, there are exceptions to that rule, and I've dealt with those exceptions in my book, Our God is Triune, but suffice it to say here that either Dr. Smith doesn't actually have training in Hebrew, or perhaps he forgot this rudimentary rule, or perhaps he's not being honest. Whichever the case, we'll assume that he doesn't know it or that he's forgotten it. But suffice it to say that this is a standard grammatical rule. For example, in Bruce Walke and O'Connor's An Introduction to Biblical Hebrew Syntax, they note, quote, "In Hebrew, the definiteness of a noun and that of its modifiers are in agreement, and the largest class of intrinsically definite nouns is names, like Yahweh." So we always have agreement grammatically, and Yahweh is definite, therefore Malach is definite. So I'm beating a dead horse here, I know, but I think this should have been known.
The text repeatedly reminds the reader that the one who is speaking is this angel of the Lord, identifying him 4 times in this small passage, in verses 7, 9, 10, and 11.
Now, a bit of a problem here for Dr. Smith. As we're going to see, he simply glosses over what this text says and doesn't actually address the issues. And so I'd like to walk through this a little bit with you and see what we can find. So it is true that the angel of the Lord is first mentioned here, at least in canonical order, by name, in Genesis 16. Despite the promise that God had given to Sarai back in Genesis 15, Sarai became convinced that God wouldn't give her a child, and so she took matters in her own hands, perhaps out of desperation, and she gave her Egyptian handmaid to Abraham, or rather at this point Abram, in order to, what she says, she sought to obtain children by her. This is in verse 2 of Genesis 16. So Abram took Hagar, and she subsequently conceived, and Sarai's rash and unfaithful decision, we could characterize it, because this obviously wasn't well thought through, and Abram's, we could say, non-existent leadership resulted in, the first love triangle. Probably not the first, and certainly not the last, but the first one mentioned in the scriptures. And so this love triangle results in Sarah having contempt for Hagar, and Hagar, evidently, according to verse 5, looked contemptuously at Sarai. And so whereas she was Sarai's handmaid, now she's also Abram's wife. And you could just imagine this is a total recipe for disaster. And so, as a result of her harsh treatment, Sarai sends Hagar into the desert. Well, she flees into the desert, but I can't imagine that Sarai was surprised by that. While in the desert, Hagar stops by a spring on the way to Shur, which implies that, given her trajectory, that her ultimate, destination was Egypt, because, of course, she was Egyptian. And it was at the spring, which is important, and we're going to come back to why this is important. It was at the spring that the angel of the Lord confronted her, saying, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? Now, this kind of question is reminiscent of other times when God asks questions like this. Genesis 3:9, where are you? Genesis 4:9, where is Abel your brother? Job 1:7 and Job 2:2, when he speaks to Satan, from where have you come? And we can even go on to, I think, Genesis 17, if my memory serves me, Genesis 21. We can also look at, there are a number of places where God asks these kinds of questions. And so the point being that this kind of question is reminiscent of the other times when God asks questions of these natures, obviously not indicating his ignorance. It's a kind of speaking, manner of speech. And so after commanding Hagar to return to Sarai, the angel of the Lord pronounced that he would multiply her progeny, which of course is the prerogative of God. He says the progeny won't be numbered for a multitude, right, in verse 10. And then the angel names Hagar's son Ishmael, which is roughly God has heard. You can God is hearing, or something like that. You can render it a variety of ways. And then he goes on to predict Ishmael's life and character in verses 11 and 12. In verse 13, we see an identification two different ways of the angel of the Lord. So verse 13 has Moses, the narrator, "So she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her, 'You are a God of seeing.' For she said, 'Truly here I have seen him who looks after me.'" So we have two things at play here. First, Moses, the narrator, is identifying the angel as Yahweh. Hagar is identifying the angel as El Roi, the God of seeing, or the God who has seen her, right? Okay, so in light of that, let's go back and listen to what Dr. Smith has to say.
This heavenly messenger speaks of Yahweh as someone other than himself in verse 11.
Right, but then in verse 13, the angel is identified as both Yahweh and God. So the only thing you could say is either this is a theophany, this is the Father appearing, and then you've got a problem because the angel is talking about God in the third person, or you've got the Trinity. You've got the Father, the Son, appearing as the angel of the Lord, who is both Yahweh and God, speaking of God in the third person, just like Jesus speaks of God in the New Testament. So that would seem to me to account for all the facts in the actual text, which, unfortunately, Dr. Smith...
Verse 11 says, "The Lord has given heed to your affliction." So there the angel speaks of the Lord, Yahweh, as someone other than himself. However, in verse 10, the angel seems to speak the very words of Yahweh himself, saying, "I will greatly multiply your descendants." End quote. How is it that Yahweh is a distinct person from this angel, and at the same time, the angel speaks the very words of God?
Now, I wonder if Dr. Smith is experiencing some acute cognitive dissonance at this point, because if you heard what he just said, how is it that the angel, right, is speaking as God, but as a distinct person from God? Right. This is why many people are Trinitarians, because you have Jesus in the New Testament speaking as God, identifying himself as God, and yet maintaining a subject-object relationship with the Father, and for that matter, the Holy Spirit. And so, to ask how is it that Yahweh is a distinct person from the angel, and at the same time the angel speaks the very word of God? Well, how is it? It's exactly the same way as Jesus is distinct from the Father in the New Testament. So what we're seeing is what I would call a proto-Trinitarian shape to this pericope, to this narrative.
There is no indication here of some sort of theophany.
Okay, there's no indication of a theophany. So we've got the angel being called Yahweh, verse 10. The angel of the Lord, or rather verse 13. He's called the angel of the Lord, but in verse 13 he's called, "So she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her." So the only speaker in the text is the angel of the Lord in Hagar. So it is the angel of the Lord who's being identified here as Yahweh. And then Hagar identifies the angel of the Lord as El Roi, the God of sight, the God of seeing. And then she says, "Truly, here I've seen him who looks after me." So to say that there's not a theophany at play, or a minimum of theophany, I would say a Christophany, is absolutely contrary to the plain reading of this text. He's called Yahweh, he's called God. So this can't be an inferior individual. And I think later Dr. Smith is going to appeal to agency and attempt to use that to counteract any notion of a Christophany. And we'll interact with that when he gets here, but just suffice it to say that he's going against what Moses has written at this point.
That idea is wholly absent from this passage. And it doesn't make sense of the fact that two persons, Yahweh and the angel are both actors in this scene.
It makes perfect sense. That's why we believe in Trinitarian Christology, because the Father and Son are different persons, and yet the Father and Son are both equally God, meaning that they possess fully the same divine nature. Because again, the only way that the Father and Son are distinct, or for that matter the Holy Spirit, is in the way that they relate to each other and to creation itself. And so basically what Dr. Smith is doing here is he's basically saying this sounds a lot like the Trinity, but that can't be because they're two distinct persons. Well, yeah, because that's Trinitarianism. What you're objecting to is the bald reading of this text and its Trinitarian implications.
Nor is there any suggestion that this angelic messenger is Jesus Christ.
Okay, is there any evidence that this angelic messenger is Jesus Christ? Well, let's think about this. We have a woman who is in sexual sin, appearing at a well, encountering the angel of the Lord who is called both God and Lord, right? She comes to this well in a time of desperation. She comes to this well dejected. She comes to this well outside of God's covenant. She comes to the well and is in need of hope because of a desperate situation. This reminds me, and it should remind you, of Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well in John 4, 1 through 28. We have a woman who is similarly dejected. She's promiscuous. She's engaged in sexual sin. She's shown up at a well, and later in Genesis 22, the second interaction between the angel of the Lord and Hagar. Hagar is going to be at an actual well. So the similarities are simply screaming here. So I think what we have here is an allusion, or at least what we have in John is an allusion back to this account on behalf of God. So to say that there's no connection, well, that's problematic because the angel of the Lord sounds a lot like Jesus, acts a lot like Jesus, is called titles that Jesus is called in the New Testament. And indeed, as I'm going to show later on in this program, that there's every reason to believe that the angel of the Lord is in fact the pre-incarnate Son of God. We continue.
And no serious modern commentator that I can find seems to think that Jesus is in view here. The most obvious explanation is that the angel is acting as an authorized agent of Yahweh.
Okay, so I guess I'm not a serious commentator. I could go with that, I guess. Maybe I'm a non-serious commentator, we'll say. But this is the consistent appeal by Unitarians, the so-called law of agency, or what is sometimes called the Shalia or Shaliach law. And what I'm holding in my hands here is Our God is Triune, where I interact with this idea as given by Unitarians. They will typically appeal to the Encyclopedia of Jewish Religion, which has this definition for agent or Shalia. The main point of the Jewish law, it says, of agency, the law of agency is expressed in the dictum, a person's agent is regarded as the person himself. Therefore, any act committed by a duly appointed agent is regarded as having been committed by the principal, and therefore bears full responsibility for it, with consequent complete absence of liability on the part of the agent. And this is what Dr. Smith is appealing to in order to say, well, what this angel is merely an agent sent from God, which simply doesn't account for the fact that he's called Yahweh, that he's called El Roy, that he's called God, and that he speaks and acts like God. Now, if you want to say that's an agent that is not himself possessing deity, you have to demonstrate that. You can't merely assume that, and then, or presuppose it from the outset, and then put that on the text like it's there. Again, Malik identifies function and not identity, not ontology. It depicts a task, not a nature. In using the agency idea as a means to discredit the notion that the angel of the Lord is both God and the Son of God is, while it is a tactic that is typical of biblical Unitarians, it's got some pretty significant problems. And so let's think about this idea a little bit more deeply. In the first place, as I mentioned, Dr. Smith is merely assuming here that the angel of Yahweh is a created agent without providing any positive biblical evidence to assert that. That's just simply assuming his conclusion on the outset and then, acting victorious. And it would seem, by definition, that Dr. Smith equates agency with finitude, which again is it's a category error, because agency, the term malik, is a term which characterizes a task and not an ontology. Jesus served as God the Father's agent in creation, and yet he resides on the eternal side of the creator-creation divide. Okay, so I'm arguing for a consistent theology. Second, the angel of Yahweh is never called a shaliach. One would expect the use of the term in any of the dozens of passages which describe the angel of Yahweh as the primary lead role salvific actor in the text. Additionally, this agency argument doesn't actually fit the biblical data at all. And I should note that in Irving's book, Mithraeon, the comparison of tales from the Old Testament and the ancient Near East, which is an entirely difficult text to get a hold of. It is the Alter Orient Altes Testament text. This text basically, the study in this text basically shows that, which is a study of stories from the A&E, the ancient Near East, comparing them with the Old Testament. And what she concludes is that there is no concept of angels in any time earlier than the OT. Even, as early as the conventional dating of J-E-D-P. J&E, I should know. And this is an insight that I received from, I think Victor Hamilton's, the Book of Genesis, TNIC commentary on Genesis 1 through 17, which is a strange book because typically you would expect it to be Genesis 1 through 11, as virtually every other commentary on Genesis is, as an aside. So when we're talking about agency and this idea that there's this, as Unitarians say, there's this established doctrine of agency, right, where you have to treat the agent precisely how you have to treat the one who sent the agent, and that's well known in the A&E, is simply not there, because the Old Testament is the first occurrence of this kind of thing, of an angel like this, as in terms of the angel of the Lord. And so it's anachronistic to say, well, this is how this principle functions in the ancient Near East, and then put that back on the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is older. It doesn't occur outside of the Old Testament, at least before it, which I think Dr. Smith alludes to that later on as he discusses this concept of agency. And if you look at the agent-sender relationship that's depicted in the Old Testament, you don't see anything like what Dr. Smith is suggesting. You don't see anyone called Yahweh, worshipped, prayed to, given devotion. In every account within the Old Testament wherein an emissary acts on behalf of his sender, right, like a human emissary, the agent is immediately identified as distinct from the one who sent the agent, and the distinction is big. For instance, the quintessential agent-sender account is Exodus 7, where Yahweh sends Moses to Pharaoh. He says, "See, I've made you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be his prophet." Okay, so here you have the one time where, an agent is identified as like God, as God. Well, there was never an acceptance by Moses of any kind of honor belonging to Yahweh. Moses didn't start receiving worship and calling himself Yahweh. Rather, Moses spoke the words that Yahweh gave him while communicating a tacit distinction between himself and God. But when you look at the angel of the Lord, you just don't see that. Now, you see a subject-object distinction between what I'm going to argue is the pre-incarnate Son and the Father, which is the same subject-object distinction you see in the New Testament. Yet, the angel of the Lord is identified as God, not like God, but as Yahweh, as we noticed in Genesis 16:13. He's identified as God. He talks in a way that only God can, naming, asking these sorts of questions, which are typical of God in the Old Testament. Now, by the time you get to the New Testament, the term apostolos is the general equivalent for shaliach, for agent, in the New Testament, in the New Testament era. And so while the apostles were representatives of Christ, they were never called Jesus or Christ, right? They were never worshipped as Christ. Even though, clearly they were sent on behalf of Christ, their mission and ministry was empowered by Christ. Even though, they were there serving as the body of Christ, they're never called Christ, they're never called Jesus, they're never worshipped. Even though Paul was an apostle and given the power to conduct miracles, he refused to be worshipped as if he was Christ, and we see that in Acts 14. And so the other problems with this agency theory, which says, it's an inferior agent who must necessarily be treated like the one who sent him, the difficulty with it is, if you adopt it, there's no meaningful way to distinguish the function of God from his agent, such that, since the angel of the Lord is so often identified as the key leading actor in the Old Testament, if the angel were actually a created agent, then you don't have any legitimate way of avoiding the violation of the first commandment. Because the agent does all of the things that God does, says things like God does, receives worship, receives prayer, is called Yahweh, is called God. Yahweh talks to him, he talks to Yahweh. You see even him being called Yahweh in the context where he's talking to Yahweh, or at least referring to Yahweh. You see this in Zechariah chapter 3. And so when Yahweh asks the rhetorical question, who is like me, as he does in Isaiah 44, well, you're supposed to say no one, right? No one is like you, Yahweh. You're in a category of one. Well, here's the problem. On the biblical unitarian view, you have to say, well, actually, there is someone like you. The angel of the Lord is a lot like you. He does what you do. He says what you say. He distinguishes himself from you, and yet he is called Yahweh. He is called God. He does all of the things that you do. And so, yeah, I know who is like you. The angel of the Lord is like you, and while we're at it, Jesus Christ is exactly like you. In fact, when you look at him, we see you. And so I think you have a real breakdown here in terms of the Unitarian argumentation. And so just to summarize my argument here, I'm saying, look, the accounts of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament are the earlier accounts like that. And you don't have an agent kind of motif in literature before that time like what we're talking about with the angel of the Lord. And so to take what people say about agency after that period, and then to put that back on the Old Testament is anachronistic. You have to treat the angel precisely the way you treat the sender. No, that's not true. It's demonstrably not true, because everywhere you look in the Old Testament, you see very clearly that that's not the case. Looking at the quintessential example, right, in Exodus 7, clearly Moses spoke the words of Yahweh while distinguishing himself. No one saw Moses and believed they had saw Yahweh, whereas people see the angel of the Lord and they believe they've seen God. You never have anything like that. And so clearly, even in this quintessential agent-sender narrative, there's a sharp distinction made between the sender and the one sent. Now, you don't have that in the accounts of the angel of the Lord. As Smith, as he mentioned, as he admitted, sometimes there's a blurring, And see, that's where the agent theory sort of breaks down and the wheels come off. Now let's continue with what he says here.
Speaking Yahweh's own words as a designated messenger. Remember that the Hebrew malach means messenger, and this Hebrew noun actually derives from the verb lach, which in Hebrew means to send a messenger. It's used in Hebrew and in a variety of Semitic languages. Therefore, it is very likely that the messenger of Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh, is acting naturally, as one would expect a messenger to act, speaking the words of the one who sent him.
Right. And he's called Yahweh in verse 13, and he's called God, and he doesn't merely speak the words for Yahweh, he speaks in the first person like Yahweh, identifying Ishmael's name, decreeing his character and what his life will be like. And then he goes about talking about the Lord he talks about Yahweh in the third person. So Dr. Smith is simply not dealing with the text at this point.
To confuse the messenger with the one who sent the messenger is to ignore the basic principle of agency that was widely recognized in the ancient Near East.
And there it is. It's widely recognized in the ancient Near East. Dr. Smith is appealing to something anachronistic there. Because again, as Irving has shown, what we're looking at in the Old Testament is the earliest material that has this kind of motif in it with the angel of the Lord. You don't have anything like that beforehand. And so if you go after the Old Testament was written and say, see, this is how agency works, hundreds of years later, or in, other literature thereafter, and read that back into the Old Testament, that simply doesn't work. And, of course, there's a personal distinction between the angel and Yahweh, because the angel is the Son of God, and the Yahweh mentioned is his Father. Except, of course, where the angel is identified as Yahweh, which is an attribution of deity unto the angel. And so you see very clearly that there's a category error being engaged in. Smith is saying, see, the angel means messenger, therefore he can't be divine, he can't be God. Well, you're betraying your own definition. If it simply means messenger, you can't associate an ontology with that. At least you can't do that without first demonstrating that that's a legitimate assumption.
So, while it is true that there is a blurring of the lines between Yahweh and this heavenly messenger, the simplest explanation is that the messenger is just that, one who speaks the message of the one true God who sent him. The heavenly angel can speak as if he was God precisely because he is communicating authoritatively as an agent.
Okay, now here's my question. Where anywhere in the Old Testament do you see that happen? Where do you have Moses or anyone talking in this way? Speaking in the first person like their God himself. Being called Yahweh, being called God, receiving worship, receiving prayer, receiving religious devotion, receiving offerings. Where does God say about Moses, my name is in him, and you better be careful because he won't forgive your sin? Where do you see anything like that anywhere in the Old Testament? You don't. And so the notion that just because he's functioning as a messenger, he must necessarily be inferior to God is something that needs to be demonstrated and not merely assumed. And I would add that Dr. Smith doesn't even deal with verse 13. He doesn't even deal with the fact that, here he's trying to debunk the Christian perspective. He doesn't even deal with the fact that the angel is called Yahweh and God. And the God who sees, which, is certainly a title of deity, El Roy.
Let's move on to our second passage. Our second point today is Hagar's second encounter with an angel. Here we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 21. I'm going to start in verse 17. God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. That's Genesis 21, verses 17 through 19. While the former episode had the heavenly messenger show up on earth and speak with Hagar, this episode details the angel who calls Hagar from heaven.
Okay, so let's take a look at this passage and see if, in fact, what Dr. Smith is saying here is substantiated. And let's go up a little bit and give a little bit more context. So, verse 8 of Genesis 21, "And the child grew and was weaned," referring to Isaac, "and Abraham made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah," verse 9, "saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing." So Ishmael is laughing, evidently in mockery, and Sarai responds poorly. Verse 10, "She said to Abraham, 'Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac.' And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, 'Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For though Isaac your offspring be named, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring.'" Now notice, the subject speaking in verse 13 is God. It says in verse 12, "But God said to Abraham," and he says, "I'm going to make a great nation of the son of the slave woman also." So Abraham arose in the early morning, gives provisions to Hagar. She puts it on her shoulder with the little boy, with Ishmael, and she heads out in the wilderness of Beersheba, perhaps again heading out to Egypt. When the water was gone, this is verse 15, she put the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite of him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look upon the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted her voice up and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, who said to her. Now, let's look at verse 12 real good. "And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her." Now, this is purposefully ambiguous, I'm arguing, that what we're seeing here is parallelism. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel called to Hagar and said, "What troubles you, Hagar?" He says, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." And so the conflict between Sarah and Hagar again result in Hagar, going out into the wilderness. She puts Ishmael down at a bow shot. The angel of the Lord, it is said, and this is verse 16, called to Hagar from heaven, right? And says, "What troubles you, Hagar? Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Now you look at this, and you go up to verse 12. God tells Abraham, "I'm going to make it," or this is verse 15, "I'm going to make a nation out of the son of the slave woman also." Here's the angel of the Lord speaking in the first person, saying precisely the same thing. I'm going to make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes. Now, the antecedent is ambiguous. Does this term God refer to the angel of the Lord, or does it refer to the God in the beginning of verse 17? Or is, in fact, this referring to one in the same subject, which I think is probably the natural reading, that the angel of the Lord is the angel of God. Rather, those terms are synonymous, but the angel of the Lord is here being called God just as he was in Genesis chapter 16. Not only that, but if you keep going and reading through Genesis, and if you go back to chapter 18, it would seem like the angel of the Lord is appearing pretty frequently. But I digress. So let's go back to Dr. Smith.
Although this story speaks of an angel of God, without the definite article in Hebrew.
Okay, again, that is erroneous. Because the nouns need to be in grammatical agreement, you have to necessarily render it the angel of the Lord. That's why it's rendered that way in English translations. If it's not rendered that way, then obviously there's some interpretive liberty taken. But because Yahweh is a definite noun, you have to render angel definitely as well. Now, as I mentioned previously, there are some exceptions to that rule, but this is not one of them. And so at that point, Dr. Smith is just arguing against the grammar.
The former story spoke of the angel of Yahweh. These differences, however, in wording are inconsequential to understanding the narrative. It just goes to show that sometimes the messenger can be described as the angel of the Lord, and sometimes the messenger can be described as the angel of God. We shouldn't make too much out of this. The heavenly messenger speaks of God as someone distinct from him in 21:17, which says, "Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is."
Yes, he speaks of someone distinct, just like the son speaks of his father as a distinct person. Exactly the same way. So let's explore that real quick, just a little bit more, looking at Zechariah chapter 3. So we have this really incredible vision. I'll begin here at verse 1. Then he, that is the angel, showed Joshua the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And so we have this heavenly courtroom imagery here. You have the angel of the Lord standing as the divine defense attorney, and then you have Satan, who is the prosecutor, and he's accusing. This is why he is often called the accuser of the brethren. Verse 2, "And the Lord said to Satan, The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire?" So here you have the angel of the Lord being called Yahweh, saying, "The Lord rebuke you, or Satan. Yahweh rebuke you." So we have the angel of the Lord who was called Yahweh, Yahweh saying, "Yahweh rebuke you." Now, what biblical Unitarians are going to say, well, that's two Yahwehs. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, Yahweh's one. Right. But we have to define that in biblical terms, not merely according to a doctrinal pre-commitment. And so what we see in this passage is the angel of the Lord being called Yahweh in the same passage that he speaks of Yahweh in the third person. Similar to Genesis 19:24, the Lord rained down fire and brimstone from heaven, from Yahweh out of heaven, Yahweh in heaven. And as you go through this passage in Zechariah 3, you see the angel of the Lord, who is called Yahweh, puts clean clothes on Joshua, defends him against Satan, and puts a clean turban on his head, which this is symbolizing the righteousness of Christ that is applied to the sinner. And it ends with saying the angel of the Lord is standing by, almost as to continually intercede. And so what I think is going on here is that this passage is typifying the work of Christ that would come, and it's simply identifying the Son of God as the angel of the Lord by implication. And so clearly you have these passages in the Old Testament which, man, they just sound like Jesus Christ. They just work like the way Jesus Christ works. They just exactly exemplify the way that he acts in the New Testament, the way that he speaks, the things that he does, the titles that he is called, because Yahweh texts are applied to the Son of God. Jesus is called God a bunch of times in the New Testament, despite the machinations of Kermit Zarley. But that's another story. Another passage we can look at is Exodus chapter 23. So here we have, let me just turn to it here. Exodus 23, beginning at verse 20. Yahweh says, and the Israelites are getting ready to, well, they think they're getting ready to go into the promised land, but because of their unfaithfulness, they're going to end up in the wilderness. But God introduces the angel of the Lord to them in the narrative. And so Exodus 23:20, behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I prepared. And so an angel, we could render that just the same as the angel. Whether or not it has the definite article in the original is inconsequential. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Well, hold on. I thought I was supposed to obey the voice of God. Well, evidently I'm supposed to obey the voice of the angel of the Lord. I'm supposed to pay attention to him. He says, do not rebel against him. Now, this is Yahweh speaking of this angel. Do not rebel against him. Okay, it sounds like I need to be obedient to him. He continues, he says, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Now, it's been well shown that the term name represents more than merely one's, the appellation that they use. It signifies their authority, it signifies their person and work, it signifies what they are. And so when we see that this angel has the name of God in him, what he's essentially saying by this turn of speech is that the angel has the powers and prerogatives of God, and that's confirmed in this very passage. Verse 22, Yahweh says, but if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, now that's interesting. If you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, meaning that you've got to obey God and you've got to obey the angel, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries, meaning that if you listen to my angel, who has my name, I will be an enemy to your enemies. Verse 23, when my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, I will blot them out. So now we have God acting on behalf of the angel. You shall not bow down to their gods nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars into pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from you. So again, this is Yahweh speaking. He says of the angel, you shall serve Yahweh your God, and he will bless your bread and water, and I will take away sickness from you. So here again we have this subject-to-object interchange between the angel of the Lord and Yahweh. We have the angel of the Lord again being identified as Yahweh, being identified as God, given divine prerogatives. He has God's name in him. He blesses, he forgives sins, he determines the future of God's people. People must obey and not rebel against him. He will take away sickness from the land. He continues in verse 26, none shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you, and you will throw it into confusion, all the people against whom you shall come, and I will make all of your enemies turn their backs to you, and I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out before you until you have increased the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines and the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods, and you shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me, and for if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Now, I wanted to read that last part because you have this prohibition against serving other gods. And then clearly you have, in this account, God telling the people to serve someone who is called Yahweh and God. And so what I'm arguing here is that this angel be kept in the divine identity, that he's not an inferior creation, he's not merely a finite agent who is serving on behalf of God, but that he is the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God. And as you continue through the Old Testament, you see this even more clearly. For instance, Judges chapter 2. The angel of the Lord or rather the text says this. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. Now hold on a second. I thought it was Yahweh who brought the people out of Egypt. That's like the key salvific work in the Old Testament. But the angel says, I did it, and I swore to give the land to your fathers, which is simply a fascinating claim, which we find that claim being given to Jesus Christ in several places. Jude verse 5, the writer says, Now I want to remind you that although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who didn't believe. And so clearly we have an allusion back to the Son of God, identifying him as the angel who brought the people out of Egypt. And we see this in that phrase, Jesus who brought the people out of Egypt, who saved the people out of Egypt. Now, I'm just looking in my book here because I know I do talk about the question of textual variance in this passage. And I note here that not only does the reading Jesus have superior attestation in the extant witnesses, both versional Greek witnesses and patristic literature, the Byzantine reading Lord occurs in a couple of, it's standard Byzantine sources. The reading of Jesus is in Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, and a number of important minuscules, minuscules 33, 81, and 88. Those are the three big ones. And then additionally, it's attested to by Origen, Cyril, Jerome, and Bede. And then Metzger says something really interesting. He notes that a majority of the committee was of the opinion, that is the textual choice committee, was of the opinion that the reading was difficult to the point of impossibility, yet Metzger noted that the critical principles seemed to therefore require the adoption of Jesus, of Jesus. And so clearly, I think this is the right reading. This is why it is in the ESV. It's in the critical editions of the New Testament, in the NA 28 and the UBS 5. And that's what we have, and so what we see is a confirmation of the fact that Jesus is the angel of the Lord, because he is identified in the same way as the angel of the Lord. And again, we have something very similar in 1 Corinthians 10. And so turning there, Paul says, beginning at verse 1, For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Paul goes on to exhort the Corinthians in verse 9 not to put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. And so clearly, Paul saw the Son of God as the God of Israel, yet distinct from the Father, just like the angel. And if you read these accounts, they just fit hand in glove. Another fascinating point, the Septuagint translates the great messianic prophecy of Isaiah 9:6. It translates it this way. Because a child was born for us, and a son was given for us, whose rulership was upon his shoulders, and his name is called the Angel of Great Counsel. Now that's interesting. So here we have the Son of God, in terms of this messianic prophecy, being called a Malik, the messenger of great counsel. And so for the Jews who translated the Tanakh into the Greek of the day, they correlated this idea of the angel of the Lord with the Son of God. And what I argue in my book is that the angel of the Lord is one of the mechanisms by which you have this non-Trinitarian stream of Judaism in the Old Testament, or rather in the Second Temple period. And so we continue here.
This is what the angel said. The angel spoke of God as someone other than himself. We have a clear line of communication in this narrative.
Right, just like the Son and the Father in the New Testament.
Sent through the angel and spoken to Hagar. In verse 18, however, the angel speaks in the first person with the words of God, saying that I will make a great nation of him, end quote. Like the previous account with Hagar and an angel, there is a blurring of the lines between God and his messenger. What is the best way to make sense of this passage? Again, a theophany seems unlikely, since a theophany is not mentioned in this passage, and the angel, I'll remind you, still resides in heaven.
Right. Just like there wasn't a theophany in Genesis 16 when the angel was called Yahweh and God. And here you have the angel basically saying precisely the same thing that God said earlier in the passage in verse 12, or rather verse 13. So you have the angel doing precisely the same things that he did in Genesis 16, but there's not a theophany. He's talking like God. He's called God. There's no theophany here. He's called Yahweh. It's really just his messenger who's inferior to him. It's not really God. Right. Arguments like these, which make Trinitarians by the boatloads.
It is also unlikely that the angel is Jesus Christ, as there is no indication that Jesus is even alive or present at all in this narrative.
Well, I'll give you that. I don't think the word Jesus is mentioned here, but clearly these two accounts, Genesis 16 to 21, are alluded to in John 4, the woman at the well, and so you have water in one view in terms of the spring, and then an actual well in this account, and you have a woman who is in sexual compromise, who is dejected. Again, seems to be an illusion. But as I mentioned, there's good biblical New Testament justification to identify Jesus as the angel of the Lord, and so you got to get past this notion that a messenger necessarily must be inferior to God, because again, that's going beyond what the term means. It simply means messenger, and again, God is called a messenger. So if you're going to say at one point that a messenger can't be God, well, you got to deal with those passages which clearly identify God as a messenger, and there are a lot of them. There's a lot of evidence for the deity of the angel of the Lord. For example, it was the angel who appeared to Moses in the burning bush and said, "Take your sandals off your feet. You're standing on holy ground." The angel identified himself with the I am saying, "I am who I am," in verse 14 of Exodus 3. The angel of the Lord swears by himself, an action that is really reminiscent of what God does when he establishes a covenant with Abraham. Jacob, when he interacted with the angel, he said, the angel said, "I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me." And when Jacob made that vow, he said, "If God be with me, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up shall be a pillar to God's house." Hosea, though, later identifies the angel, saying Jacob met God at Bethel. And he went on to identify him as Yahweh, the God of hosts, and Yahweh is his memorial name. So the prophetic interpretation of that angel of the Lord account is that it was Yahweh. Jacob prayed to the angel of Yahweh when he blessed Ephraim and Manasseh. We mentioned that. The angel of Yahweh does not merely speak in the name of God, but rather God's name is in him. We already looked at that in Exodus 23. And the angel of Yahweh calls himself Yahweh. It's in Genesis 22:16. And so in this, close to the same pericope that we're in, looking at the very next chapter in Genesis 22:16, let's start at verse 15. "And the angel of the Lord, angel Yahweh, called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord," declares Yahweh, "because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son." And so here clearly we have the angel of the Lord identifying himself as Yahweh, swearing by himself only as God does. So real clear that he is no mere creaturely messenger. When God was angry at Balaam, the angel of Yahweh appeared, and after correcting Balaam by means of his donkey, the angel of Balaam the angel told Balaam, "Go with the men, but speak only the word that I tell you." And Balaam interpreted that command by saying, "The word that God puts in my mouth, that I must speak." And so from Balaam's interpretation, the angel was God. The angel of the Lord identified himself as the commander of the Lord's army and said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." So just in the same way he's said that to Moses in the burning bush, he says it again to Joshua. And just a few verses later in Joshua 6:2, the commander of Yahweh's army is identified as Yahweh by Joshua. The angel of the Lord has a wonderful name, just like Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. He's given that wonderful name or identified with it in Judges 13. And in fact, I would like to turn there. Judges chapter 13, it's really a fascinating passage. And so there's this motif in the scriptures which teach us that God is invisible, right? That you can't see God. Exodus 33:20 tells us, just turning to that passage here, no one can see my face and live. So you can't see God. If you see God, you're going to die. And that's the consistent claim in the scriptures, not in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. You shall not see my face, for no man shall see me and live. Well, the New Testament continues that in even stronger terms. John 1:18, no one has seen God. That's repeated throughout the Gospel of John. Paul says, no one has ever seen or can see God in 1 Timothy 6:16. That reading of the Bible is reflected in Second Temple literature. For example, it's reflected in Second Enoch and the works of Philo. And Philo's Moses. In the first chapter, he talks about God being invisible. And that, I think, is pretty much the consistent testimony of Christianity and Judaism, that God is invisible. And yet, as we read the Old Testament, clearly people have seen God. And so you've got to come up with a way to harmonize this dilemma. People have seen God quite clearly, and yet God says he cannot be seen. And so what do? Well, John gives us a solution. In John 1:18, he says, no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Now, there is a significant textual variant here, where you could have the only Son, huios, or the only God, theos. But the earliest reading is theos, monogenes theos, and both God and Son, theos and huios, have support in patristic literature, and we would expect that because the same phrase using huios is used in John 3:16, John 3:18, and 1 John 4:9. And so we would affirm that the fathers would affirm both readings, and they do. But because of its difficulty, and that's one of the canons in textual criticism, and its early attestation, we can say that the only God is to be preferred, and that again is why it is in the critical editions of the Greek New Testament. And so no one has ever seen God. We know that much. We've seen that said in the Old Testament in Exodus 33:20 and other places. And yet, John writes, the only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. And so John's solution to the dilemma, God is invisible and yet is visible, is that we haven't seen the Father. When Jacob wrestled with God, when Moses ate with Yahweh and saw him face to face, he saw the Son. He didn't see the Father. That's the mechanism through which John resolves this dilemma. And so John doesn't merely assert that no one has ever seen God, but he says no one has ever seen God, meaning ever seen God, but the only God who is at his side has made him known. And so John is not merely appealing to the Son's incarnate ministry, but to his role as the exegeter, if you will, of God, a role which he possessed before the incarnation. And this is precisely why John characterizes Jesus as God the Word. He's the Word in that he is the final and perfect revelation of God to man. And this is confirmed in a number of ways. It's confirmed by the New Testament's continual attribution of invisibility to the Father and not to the Son. It's confirmed in the way that John depicts Christ as Yahweh and the angel of the Yahweh, identifying him as the subject of notable theophanies. And I'm not going to go into all those because I've mentioned some of them already. But, for instance, just to mention one, John 12:41 identifies Jesus as the Yahweh Isaiah saw. That's confirmed because no one can see the Father, but they can see the Son. And so this is a principle we're gleaning from John himself. And there's many, many, many other passages in the Old Testament which simply identify the angel as having deity. Going back to Judges 13, though, which is, I got sidetracked here, which is, you could probably tell, is not uncommon. You have the angel of the Lord appearing to Manoah's wife. She's unnamed. And she announces that she's going to bear a son, says he's going to be a Nazirite, and the woman goes and says, "A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of the angel of God." Very awesome. And so Manoah prayed to the Lord and asked the Lord, "Can you send the man that you had sent to my wife?" And God listened. This is verse 9 of Judges 13 to Manoah. And the angel of God came again to the woman as she sat in a field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. So the woman quickly ran and grabbed her husband. And then you have this interesting interaction between Manoah and the angel of the Lord. Manoah asks, "Are you the man who spoke with this woman?" And he said, "I am." Now, that's interesting. I am. Okay. Really an interesting translation. Which I believe that is Anihu, which is the same I am formula used in Deuteronomy and in Isaiah, and of course is translated as ego eimi, as in the Septuagint. And so the account continues here. The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat of anything that comes from the vine, neither let her drink wine or strong drink or eat any unclean thing. All that I commanded her, let her observe." And so he's commanding her to do things just as God would. And Manoah says to the angel, "Please let us detain you and prepare a young goat for you." And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "If you detain me, I will not eat of your food, but if you prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to the Lord." And then the ESV has this parenthetically, but it says, "For Manoah did not know that he was the angel of the Lord." Now, I would just ask, Dr. Smith, why is that statement there? Well, I think the answer is that it's confirmed, or we're told, rather, why it's there in the balance of the passage. Manoah asks the angel, "What is your name, so that when your words can be true, we can honor you, we can worship you?" And the angel said to him, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?" Now, I'll just leave that there, leave it hang in the ether. What ends up happening is Manoah prepares this offering, the angel of the Lord accepts it as a burnt offering, and then Manoah and his wife fell on their faces to the ground. And it says in verse 21, the angel of the Lord had appeared no more to Manoah and his wife. And then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. So the times that they were calling him a man, they didn't know that he was the angel of God. And then Manoah and his wife has said, "We will surely die, for we have seen God." But his wife said to him, if Yahweh had meant to kill us, he would have not accepted the burnt offering and the grain offering at our hands. And so here, Manoah and his wife are calling the angel God and Yahweh. He accepts the offering. He takes the worship. His name is wonderful. This is not any mere messenger. This is not an inferior creature. This is God the Son, pre-incarnate. And that is the consistent testimony of the Old Testament. And we could walk through hundreds of other passages, looking at this, at the way that the angel of the Lord appears. And so the argumentation given by Dr. Smith just doesn't account for the information in the Old Testament, let alone the information in Genesis 16 and 21.
We are left with only one reasonable option, and that is that the heavenly messenger is speaking the words of God precisely as an authorized agent.
Now, why couldn't he be speaking the words of God precisely because he's an authorized agent, and at the same time, since he's identified as Yahweh, identified as God, receives worship, receives prayer, be considered God himself, meaning not the Father, but the Son? Well, that would be the question to ask Dr. Smith, and I'd like to hear his answer to that. I have an idea of what he would say, but my point here is that he's sort of dismissing the facts of the case out of hand, saying, it can't be this. This can't be a theophany or a Christophany because he's a messenger, which again is a category error.
In other words, the angel of God is able to speak the words of God in the first person, not because the angel is God, but because angel means messenger.
And so you see, again, real clearly at that statement that for him, angel connotes an ontology. Now, again, the problem with that is God is called an angel. Genesis 48, Exhibit A. There's 10 other examples, but we'll go with that one. So if you're going to say the term angel means finite or creaturely or not divine, not Yahweh, then you have to substantiate that rather than merely assume it. You have to provide a basis for your statement. What he's doing is merely assuming it from the outset and say, see, he's a messenger, therefore he can't be God. But he's called God. He's called Yahweh. So explain to me, Dr. Smith, explain to me any place where you have, again, a messenger, an agent who is worshipped, who is prayed to, who is called Yahweh and God, who receives religious devotion, anywhere like that, anywhere else in the ancient Near East, before the Old Testament or in the Old Testament. Don't show me Second Temple stuff, because that's anachronistic. Show me the beef, as it were.
And this messenger of God naturally is authorized to convey God's own words to Hagar. This explanation takes into account the fact that both God and the angel are separate parties, while acknowledging the role of the messenger as a principal agent, authorized and able to speak on behalf of the one who sent him.
Right, so when you read the Old Testament, you never see Moses saying, I, the Lord, say to you, when he's functioning in this agent capacity, right? He doesn't go to Pharaoh and say, hey, Pharaoh, I'm Yahweh, let my people go. He doesn't say that. You never have anything like that. So, again, we're trading in this, we're trading in the currency of a category error. When you say that messenger necessarily means inferior, you need to have some kind of substantiation of that claim. And I know I'm beating a dead cat here, but we continue.
Third passage today is looking at Jacob's dream of an angel of God. This short passage is in Genesis 31, starting in verse 11. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. He said, Lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats, which are mating, are striped, speckled, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. That's Genesis 31, verses 11 through 13. Here we have another passage where there is a blurring of the lines between God and the angel. This occurs in the midst of a dream that Jacob experiences. And dreams involving angelic communication is quite rare in Scripture. You can also see it in Daniel 7, verse 1, and Matthew 2, verses 12 through 19. In this dream, only the angel is mentioned, although it is interesting to note that the angel's description in Hebrew of Genesis 31:11 reads, angel of the God, with the definite article attached to God. So, while the angel does not mention God in the dream as someone other than himself, it is clear that the narrator of Genesis wants the reader to know that this angel is an angel of the God.
Now, Dr. Smith at this point is making my argument for me. So when you, again, and I think this might be the fifth time that I'm saying this, when you have a definite phrase, rather a noun that is modified by a definite noun, the two nouns must be in grammatical accord. With Yahweh, it's always definite, so it's always the angel of Yahweh. But with God, you can have an indefinite God or a definite God. Typically, it's taken in a definite construction. And if you've got angel of the God, it must be the angel of the God. You can't have an angel of the God, because in Hebrew, that construction doesn't exist. You have to have grammatical accord between the two nouns. For some reason, he doesn't see that. He doesn't know about that, but you can look at any standard grammar, even an introductory grammar, and see that this is just typical, standard, and conventional Hebrew.
Thus, indicating two distinct persons.
Now you're thinking, two distinct persons, the Father and the Son. The angel of the Lord who says, I'm the God of Bethel, meaning the house of God. That's him. The angel of the Lord is dwelling in the house of God. The one that wrestles with Jacob, the one that interacts with him, that is the Son of God. Right. Distinct from his Father, but fully God. Identified as God, prayed to, receives worship, etc.
Furthermore, a messenger always presumes that some other party or person has sent that messenger with a task or announcement.
Right. The messenger was sent from God, but it doesn't mean that he's inferior necessarily. That would be a category error.
Moreover, Genesis has already established in multiple places that the true God is the sender and authorizer of heavenly messengers with the status of an agent. Still, it is useful here to test the other hypotheses. The theophany hypothesis finds no support, for there is little indication that God appeared in the form of an angel, and there would really be no reason for this to take place in the midst of a dream.
Okay, so he says, I am the God of Bethel, but he didn't appear. I mean, this is the same thing he said with Hagar. The angel isn't God, yet he's called God. He's called Yahweh. So, to say that it's not a theophany, at minimum, you're simply arguing against the plain language of the text. It's not a theophany because it's a vision. Well, who comes up with these definitions where you've got to have a non-visionary experience for it to be a theophany? Theophany simply means sighting of God. And again, if God is invisible, and here God is visible, if he sees him, then you've got to account for that somehow. You've either got to define invisibility to mean visibility, or you've got to have a doctrine of the Trinity, which is what John's explanation is. And so I think Dr. Smith at this point is making my case for me when he says there's no theophany and yet God is called, the angel of the Lord is called God quite clearly. He says, I am the God of Bethel. I mean, what more do you need? I mean, this just goes to show you, with biblical Unitarians, often you could have clear, explicit statements in the Bible that they will simply explain away, like ad infinitum. I am the God of Bethel. It's not a theophany. No, it's merely God's agent being sent who's somehow inferior, but I don't know, I don't have any way of substantiating that. But it's not God, even though he says he's God. Right. Even though he promises things like God does, even though he gives names like God does, even though he talks about things like God does, even though he receives worship and prayer like God does. But he's not God. Okay. Right.
The Jesus hypothesis also fails to be persuasive because Jesus is not even mentioned here or anywhere in Genesis. Perhaps the angel is called God here. That's a distinct possibility, claiming to actually be the God of Bethel.
it's a possibility. It's a possibility that the angel is called God here. That's a pretty amazing statement, because it literally says, the angel of the Lord said to me in a dream, and then it says, I am the God of Bethel. So I think we need to get out of the realm of possibility, Dr. Smith, and see quite clearly it does say that the angel of the Lord is the God of Bethel. And if we keep going in Genesis, looking at the account of, Jacob wrestling with God, what does he say? He calls the place Peniel, because he's seeing God face to face, precisely what we're told in Exodus that you can't do. He calls, for example, interesting passage, and sometimes we see this in places in Scripture, which is, if you read the text carefully, you'll see this. Genesis 35. God said to Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there. Make an altar to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. Now notice this. God is speaking in the first person. Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there. Make an altar to the God who appeared to you. So God is speaking of God in the third person. It's these kinds of texts that the biblical Unitarians simply cannot account for. I know of what the explanations are from other non-Trinitarian and from other scholars, but the objections simply do not hold up, and biblical Unitarians never say anything about passages like this. They never say anything about the fact that, look, on the one hand, God is said to be invisible, and here he is visible. What's the solution? How do you solve the dilemma? Because over and over and over again we're told, I've seen God face to face. With Moses, I don't speak to him in a prophecy or in a dream, but I speak to him face to face and mouth to mouth. So you've got men seeing God, you've got prohibitions against seeing God, you have to harmonize that some way. And again, it's got to be at minimum a theophany, because he specifically says, I am the God of Bethel, the house of God. We continue.
But this would need to be qualified by highlighting the principle of agency recognized with an angel who belongs to the God.
Right, so what he's basically saying is we have to qualify what is being said in the text with our pre-arrived at conclusion regarding the phrase, the angel of the Lord, which is grammatically indefensible. We've got to read the text through the lens of our doctrinal pre-commitment to Unitarianism, reading the grammar of Malach wrong, of Malach Yahweh wrong, or in this case, Malach El, or whichever the construction. Malach Ha-El, maybe. And we've got to read that wrong, and then we've got to read that back into the text and say, even though he says he's God, he's not really God, see? Because we're relying upon a principle of agency that is simply nowhere to be found in the Old Testament. If you derive a principle of agency from the Old Testament, what you're going to see is it's nothing like Dustin Smith's principle of agency.
One God, the one true God. The safest bet, it seems, is to regard the angel as just that, an angelic messenger, authorized as an agent.
Right, don't regard him as God like the text says. Just regard him as an angelic messenger, which is a tautology. Angelic messenger, that's like saying a messaging messenger. An angelic messenger. I think what he's saying is that this is a celestial creature who has wings, but that's not what the text says. And Jacob certainly doesn't treat this subject like that. Rather, he builds an altar to that same subject. A stack of stones in order to sacrifice to the subject. So, evidently, on Dustin's view, you can worship the angel, you can pray to him, you can treat him like God, you can be scared of seeing him just like one would be scared of seeing God. You can make an altar to him. You can, he says all the things that God says, but yet he's still an agent, which obliterates the first and second commandments. When God says, who is like me? Well, Dr. Smith says, your angel, your created angel, who's an angelic messenger, a messaging messenger, evidently. Well, I hope I've demonstrated my problems with this sort of thing, and I know that I've gone a long time here, And I hope I haven't just been rambling on. Maybe I have. But I hope I've given you a little bit to think about in terms of the problems with this presentation. And again, I have a book that sort of parses through some of these things. Our God is Triune. Pick that up and look through some of that material. And again, I'll look out for an article that'll be talking specifically about this subject. And we'll see what happens in terms of interacting further with Dustin Smith's presentation on messengers or angels. I think it's a series that has maybe 15 parts or so. I don't know specifically, but we'll see what else we can interact with in that regard. And I hope this is beneficial to you. Thank you very much for listening. If you're listening on iTunes, just take a moment and write an iTunes review, leave a couple of stars, and this is one of the ways that people find the program. Thank you very much.
Our God is in the heavens. Our God is in the heavens. Our God is in the